Criminals think prison is the end of the road, but for predators, it's often just the beginning of a new nightmare. Today we look at the craziest treatment of 5 predators in prison. John Gogan. John Gogan's story begins with his time as a trusted Catholic priest, but soon spirals into a scandal that shook the Roman Catholic Church to its core. But the real twist? What happened to him behind bars? Gogan grew up in a devout Catholic family, which led him to become a priest in 1962. However, soon after, allegations of abuse emerged. In the 1970s, families reported that Gogan had molested their children, often during church activities or in their homes. Rather than addressing these accusations, the church repeatedly transferred him to different parishes, attempting to manage the issue internally. The church's actions were driven by a misguided belief in rehabilitation and a desire to protect its reputation. Gogan underwent psychiatric evaluations and therapy during this time, but his abusive behavior persisted. The tipping point came in the 1990s when more survivors began to come forward. In 1996, a mother from Waltham, Massachusetts, filed a lawsuit against Gogan, accusing him of molesting her 3 sons. This case, along with subsequent lawsuits, brought a flood of allegations to light. Between 1996 and 2000, over 70 individuals accused Gogan of abuse, leading to a series of criminal charges and civil lawsuits. In response to the mounting pressure and public scrutiny, the church finally defrocked Gogan in 1998, a step that marked the end of his official status as a priest, but not the end of the legal battles he faced. In 2002, a pivotal moment arrived with the Boston Globe's investigation, famously known as the Spotlight Report. The in-depth coverage exposed how the Archdiocese of Boston had systematically covered up abuse cases, using Gogan's situation as a prime example. The revelations were shocking. More than 130 boys had come forward with stories of abuse, and internal church documents showed how church officials, including Cardinal Law, had repeatedly only reassigned Gogan despite knowing the risks. The legal consequences followed swiftly. In 2002, Gogan was convicted of indecent assault and battery for groping a 10-year-old boy at a swimming pool in 1991. He received a 9 to 10-year prison sentence, which many saw as a small fraction of what his victims believed he deserved. While serving this sentence, Gogan faced additional lawsuits, and the Archdiocese reached a $10 million settlement with 86 of Gogan's victims. Many felt that the settlements were inadequate given the trauma and lifelong impact suffered by those abused. So, they sought accountability from church leaders, including Cardinal Bernard Law, who had overseen many of the transfers. This pressure ultimately led to Law's resignation in December 2002. As for Gogan himself, his time in prison was marked by isolation and fear, reflecting the disdain and anger directed at him by both inmates and some guards. Despite being placed in protective custody, where he lived alongside other vulnerable prisoners, he was often targeted for his past actions. Fellow inmates would shout insults, calling him Skinner, a prison term for child abuse. He frequently skipped meals to avoid confrontations, surviving on canteen food to minimize exposure to the hostile environment. While he faced ridicule from other prisoners, Gogan's real concern, as he expressed, was the harsh treatment from certain correctional officers. He accused one officer in particular of taking pleasure in tormenting him. According to Gogan's accounts, this officer went out of his way to remind him of his crimes, allegedly taunting him by posting news articles about his offenses near his cell. The situation reached a climax on August 23, 2003, when Joseph Druce, another inmate with a history of violence, managed to enter Gogan's cell at the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center. Druce, who had been convicted of murder, trapped Gogan inside by jamming the door. He then attacked him, binding and gagging him before strangling him with a bedsheet. Druce continued to assault Gogan even after he had lost consciousness, jumping on his body and delivering further blows. The attack went unchecked for several minutes, largely due to the compromised security situation in the unit at the time. Normally, 2 officers were assigned to this section, but only one was present that day, having been called away for another task. By the time other officers responded, Gogan had suffered fatal injuries. His death was ruled as ligature strangulation and blunt chest trauma. Druce's motivation for the murder was deeply rooted in his own traumatic history. During his trial, he claimed that he felt a sense of duty to stop Gogan, viewing him as unrepentant and continuing to pose a threat, even behind bars. Druce himself had been a victim of severe abuse during his childhood, including physical beatings and sexual abuse by multiple adults. During the 2006 trial, Druce attempted to use an insanity defense, arguing that his past abuse and mental health struggles left him with an impaired ability to control his actions. However, the jury rejected this defense, finding the murder to be premeditated. As a result, Druce received an additional life sentence for Gogan's murder. But the story of abuse and its consequences doesn't end with Gogan. The disturbing narrative continues with figures like Paul Scott. Taking advantage of a child is one thing, but arranging for other predators to do the same, that's a level of cruelty that even many criminals would find unfathomable. Nevertheless, this is exactly what Paul Scott did. Years before the arrest, Scott, then in his 60s, was living in Wickenfields where it was here that he started targeting vulnerable children. His modus operandi involved ingratiating himself into families' lives, often seeking out situations where he could exploit the trust placed in him. Scott's actions came to light through the courageous complaint of a victim, a boy who had endured years of abuse under his manipulation. This young victim detailed how Scott would arrange for other men to come to a residence in Bedfordshire where the abuse occurred repeatedly. The boy reported that Scott would often give him substances to make him sleepy, rendering him defenseless during the assaults. The abuse was systematic, taking place over several years until 2009, and was fueled by Scott's disturbing fantasies. The details of Scott's crimes emerged during his trial at Luton Crown Court. The jury was presented with a harrowing account of how Scott orchestrated the events, even in the face of protests from some of the men involved, who eventually urged him to stop. Yet Scott remained undeterred, driven by his desires. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Scott denied all charges of child rape during the trial, forcing the victim to relive the trauma in court. His refusal to take responsibility was seen as a further act of cruelty. Ultimately, he was found guilty on 6 of the 7 charges of rape, along with charges related to the possession of indecent images of children. His sentence? 21 years in prison. Scott's legal troubles did not start with this case. Prior to his arrest for the abuse in Bedfordshire, he had already been convicted in 2011 for possessing and distributing indecent images, resulting in a 3-year and 9-month sentence. This earlier conviction should have served as a warning, but it did not prevent him from continuing his predatory behavior. During his incarceration, Scott faced the realities of being a convicted child abuser in prison, a position that put him at odds with other inmates and made him a target for violence. Initially held at Bedford Prison, Scott also experienced the intensity of a prison riot that directly threatened his safety. He was later transferred to Nottingham Prison. Daniel McCormack. Daniel McCormack served as a Catholic priest in the Archdiocese of Chicago, primarily at St. Agatha's Parish on the city's west side. He was also a teacher and a basketball coach at a local school, roles that allowed him regular contact with young boys. This position of trust, however, became the foundation for his abuses, which spanned from the early 2000s up until 2006. Allegations against McCormack first surfaced during his seminary days in the late 1980s, but just as in the case of Gogan, these reports were either ignored or insufficiently addressed by the church hierarchy. By 2001, the allegations had become more serious, with multiple claims of inappropriate behavior toward boys at St. Agatha. What did the church do? It assigned a monitor to oversee his behavior, a measure that would soon prove ineffective, and everyone was about to find that out the hard way. In October 2005, the Archdiocese's Professional Review Board recommended that McCormack be removed from his position due to the ongoing allegations. However, no immediate action was taken, allowing him to remain in his role for several more months. The final tipping point came when 2 boys reported that they had been sexually abused by McCormack. Police arrested McCormack in January 2006, charging him with multiple counts of aggravated criminal sexual abuse involving boys aged 8 to 12. Audits revealed that the church had ignored or mishandled over 30 allegations against McCormack throughout his career. In July 2007, McCormack accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to 5 counts of criminal sexual abuse. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and while the plea deal spared the victims from having to testify in a public trial, it also meant that many questions about the church's cover-up efforts would remain unanswered in court. During his time in prison, McCormack showed little remorse for his actions. Reports from the time indicate that he did not apologize to his victims, missing an opportunity to express contrition in court. After serving about half of his sentence due to good behavior, McCormack was released, only to face civil commitments and ongoing legal challenges aimed at keeping him confined due to his status as a sexually violent person. James King. Imagine finding out that a trusted family friend, someone who always seemed kind and dependable, had been hiding something dark all along. James King was a deceiver who shattered everything with a betrayal no one saw coming. King was born and raised in Texas, where he spent most of his life, building a reputation as a friendly and dependable presence in his community. His history did not include any known criminal activities before the events that would later lead to his arrest, which made the revelations about his actions all the more shocking to those who thought they knew him well. On May 8, 2011, King hosted a gathering at his home, a typical event where friends and family mingled, enjoying what seemed like an ordinary social occasion. Among the guests was a 5-year-old girl who was left in his care for the night. When the other adults retired for the evening, King saw an opportunity. He lured the child into the kitchen, offering her a treat, a sundae. This seemingly innocent gesture turned sinister when King assaulted the child, taking advantage of the quiet moments when everyone else was asleep. After the initial assault, King attempted a second attack later that night, but the young girl resisted and managed to escape his grasp. In the aftermath, the trauma and confusion left the child unable to immediately report what had happened. King continued to live his life as though nothing had occurred, with the crime hidden behind a facade of normalcy. It wasn't until 2020, nearly a decade later, that it was revealed what had taken place. At the time, the victim, being around 15 years old, bravely confided in her mother about the abuse she had suffered at King's hands. This disclosure triggered an investigation by the Harris County Sheriff's Office. During the subsequent investigation, King denied the allegations, attempting to use his previously clean record to assert his innocence. However, the detailed account provided by the victim, combined with inconsistencies in King's statements, led to his arrest. During his 3-day trial, prosecutors focused on the trust the family had placed in King and the profound violation he had committed. King was ultimately convicted of aggravated sexual assault of a child. Despite his claims of innocence, the jury found the evidence against him overwhelming, resulting in a 20-year prison sentence. Given his age, 75 years old at the time of sentencing, his punishment effectively meant he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. Arthur Frederick Good III. What really happens when a man who claims he'd kill again is locked behind bars? Arthur Frederick Good III wasn't just notorious for his crimes. His time in prison reveals an even more unsettling side of his story. Once inside, the dark reality of his behavior only grew more disturbing, raising questions about how someone so unapologetic for their actions is handled behind bars. From a young age, Good struggled with significant developmental and behavioral issues. By his teenage years, he began showing signs of sexual interest in children, and his behavior soon escalated to criminal acts. These early offenses were often met with leniency, as his parents consistently posted bail and sought to place him in various psychiatric programs, rather than leaving him in the criminal justice system. In the mid-1970s, Good faced multiple accusations of child molestation, but many charges were reduced or dismissed due to his mental health status and the inability of the legal system to hold him accountable effectively. In 1975, after molesting 2 young boys, he was sentenced to probation on the condition that he receive psychiatric treatment at the Spring Grove Hospital Center in Baltimore. Good admitted himself, but soon left without completing the program. He then traveled to Cape Coral, Florida, where his parents had relocated, hoping to start anew. It was in Florida that Arthur Good's crimes took a horrifying turn. On March 5, 1976, Good encountered 9-year-old Jason Verdow, a child who would become his first known murder victim. Good lured Jason into a wooded area near a school bus stop, where he assaulted and then strangled the boy to death. The discovery of Jason's body shocked the local community, and law enforcement quickly launched a manhunt for the perpetrator. But by then, Good had already fled back to Maryland. Back in Maryland, Good abducted 10-year-old Billy Arthes and later encountered 11-year-old Kenneth Dawson. He took both boys with him on a bus trip to Virginia, where he subjected them to further abuse. During this journey, Good murdered Kenneth Dawson in front of Billy. It was a terrified Billy Arthes who ultimately led authorities to Good. When a concerned citizen in Falls Church, Virginia, recognized the boy from a missing person report, she alerted the police. Good was arrested and tried first in Maryland for the murder of Kenneth Dawson. He was sentenced to life in prison after being found competent to stand trial. However, his most severe punishment came after his extradition to Florida, where he faced charges for the murder of Jason Verdow. In Florida, He chose to represent himself during parts of the trial, delivering bizarre statements, and at one point even urging the jury to convict him and sentence him to death. On March 22, 1977, Arthur Good was sentenced to death by electrocution in Florida's electric chair. His sentencing marked the beginning of a long stint on death row. However, throughout his time in prison, he wrote incessantly to media outlets, public officials, and even the families of his victims, describing his crimes in graphic detail and showing no signs of regret. Prison officials eventually curtailed his letter-writing privileges. On the morning of April 5, 1984, the switch was finally flipped, and 2,000 volts of electricity coursed through Arthur Good's body. He was pronounced dead 5 minutes later, marking the end of a life that had been defined by violence, manipulation, and a complete disregard for the suffering of others. If you enjoyed this video and want to dive deeper into similar content, go ahead and click on the videos displayed on your screen right now. Each one offers more captivating stories and insights that you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.